Good morning, everyone. It is time to begin class this morning. We're certainly thankful for your attendance. We realize we have some guests in our midst, and we're especially thankful that you're able to be out with us this morning. We are, for those who haven't been with us this past week, we are studying the book of Job. Last week we spent our entire time with an introduction to the book, trying to frame things up, make sure we understood the basic sections of the book and the main messages of the book. But today we actually progress into the actual study of the text. So we're looking at chapters 1 and 2 from the book of Job. We'll take a look at those chapters, see what lessons we can draw from them, and prepare ourselves for what will come next. As we talked about last week, of course, this prologue is written in prose. We're going to be completing this section hopefully today, and then we'll move into sections of poetry, which will dominate virtually the entirety of the rest of the book until we get to the very end. The epilogue again will be written in prose. So before we get started this morning, let's go to God in a word of prayer. Bow with me if you would. Father in heaven, we are so very thankful for the opportunity to come out this day as a group of your people to study from your word. We are thankful, Father, for the record of the book of Job and for what it can instruct us with regard to suffering in this life, how to consider these things, how to work through them in our own lives. And we pray, Father, that as we progress through this book, we can extract those important truths that you would have us to understand. We ask that you be with all the classes that are assembled here this day. May good be accomplished in the time spent together. All of these things, of course, we ask through our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And through him we pray this. Amen. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Job. It's actually fairly quick reading. It's very interesting reading. Extremely dramatic, presents a lot of information to us about Job. When we think about chapter 1 in particular, before we get started into some of the detail of chapter 1, I'm just interested in what you would regard as important or dramatic features. Of course, the whole chapter itself is quite dramatic, but what would you conclude? What would be your major observations? What would, when you think about chapter 1, what really stands out to you? Anita?
I like the part where he makes offerings for his children just in case somebody sent while they were out at the feast. All
right, very good. So we do have that wonderful example of a father's concern for his children. And of course, the father's concern for the children comes from his devotion to God and his devotion to his children. And of course, sacrifices being offered would not be something new. We would find those traced all the way back to the time of Noah, offering sacrifices. And so it would be consistent with the patriarchy and their responsibility for the religious welfare of their families. But it is interesting to say that he was doing this continually. So this wasn't just a random occurrence. It wasn't something that he just thought of on the spur of the moment. And I think that speaks to the devotion he had to God and his concern for the spiritual welfare of his family. Very good. Very good point. What else stands out to you in chapter 1? Rick?
Well, it starts out with a description of Job and all his possessions. It doesn't start out with a description of a nation. It doesn't start out with a description of some sort of condition, but it describes Job, and then it goes into a conversation between God and Satan.
All right, very good. So obviously at the very beginning, as Rick points out, we have this wonderful description of Job. And it talks about, first of all, his stance before God, and then it goes on to a discussion of all the things that he has accomplished or has accumulated. He attributes that to the blessing of God. In verse 21, we see that that's exactly how he frames things up and understands the origination of those blessings. And even at the end, we have a recognition of Job as being the greatest man of the East. It wasn't that he was a relatively impressive man or a great man of a localized area. He was the greatest man of the East. And generally, scholars would understand that to be all the way from what would be referred to as Palestine up until really the western edge of the Euphrates River. That was what was considered typically as being the area under consideration. So this was a very significant statement about who Job was and how he was viewed by others. Very good. Carol.
Well, not only in chapter 1 but chapter 2 that Satan has to ask God about, God tells him how can you go in his dealings with man. He limits it. God is still in control no matter what Satan wants to accomplish.
All right, very good. So we do have these very provocative interactions that occur between Satan and Jehovah. But as Carol points out, one of the important lessons that we want to see from this is that while God yields to the request that Satan has made, he establishes limits. He establishes limits to the power and the control that Satan can have over the life of Job. And so there is a limiting force in place. God still is ultimately the decision maker and in control, even though Satan is a son of God in the sense that he's a created being, an angelic being, a heavenly being, but nevertheless he is an apostate, rebellious son of God. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Scott, did you have your hand up? Other things that really struck you from chapter 1. Pat?
Well, it's always bothered me that God parlayed with Satan. And it makes me wonder, and I'm not going to get into the debate. I'm not a theologian, but there's people that believe every word happened just like it happened. There's people that know it's just, a lot of it's just prose. And it makes me wonder about this book. Why would he do that? Does he do that with all of us? Does he just build a wall around us if you're a believer and say to Satan, okay, you can do these things, you can't do that? Or is this just a story to just show us, to give us an example? Did it really happen this way? Did he really parlay with Satan? That's always bothered me.
Very good. And I think some of these questions we won't be able to answer from chapters 1 and 2, but maybe the answers will become more revealing as we progress on. Now, one of the points we made last week is that if we regard Jesus as the Son of God and we understand that his word is truth and the work of the Spirit is truth, we noted that we have two unimpeachable witnesses with regard to Job being a genuine character, because we have reference to Job in the book of Ezekiel from the Old Testament. We have reference to the man Job living from the New Testament in the book of James. So we do have inspired men as witnesses of the fact that Job was an actual person who lived upon the face of the earth. And some of these bigger questions we'll have to move into as we move further into the text itself. But very good question, valid question that many have. What else do we see in chapter 1 that we think is particularly important or dramatic? Sean.
As you read the dialogue, just the faith and the trust that God has in Job, because he said, if you considered my servant Job, that, if you're going to test somebody, test him. And then Satan's dialogue, well, yeah, he's faithful to you because look at all you've done for him. But as you go through the story, you see that it's much different than that.
Right, exactly. And we have two instances of that. Of course, one in chapter 1 and one in chapter 2, where the question is posed. And God and Satan have very different opinions about the circumstances at play. And we'll pull that out as we move through. All right. Yes, Tim.
I was just thinking, in this whole thing, the bottom line is, Job, as it says here, did not sin nor charge God with wrong. And the bottom line is, he said, naked I came into this world, and naked shall I return. Blessed, well, that be the name of the Lord. And that's how high he had a regard for his Creator. He knew who was in control, and who would ultimately, the bottom line is, who his soul would be entrusted. I entrust my soul to God. And no matter what physical things happen to us in life, we have to ultimately believe that spiritually, God is the one who I'll be before and saved. So I'll lose everything. And the Bible even says that, doesn't it? It says, what shall a profit man gain the whole world and lose his own soul? And what will a man give in exchange for? We see Job didn't do that.
Right. It is very noteworthy that he did not sin with his lips. He did not sin with his lips in terms of what he said. Now, ultimately, part of that commentary about Job will be moderated because he will come to incorrectly believe that God is the source of his suffering. But he knows nothing about these conversations that are taking place between God and Satan. All right, Bruce.
It's interesting too because the focus is on Job and all that happened to him. There's a lot of other people that have been impacted. Servants, their families, children, all those people that had nothing in this at all, and so they are impacted by things that had nothing really directly to do with them. And so sometimes in life today, things impact us that had nothing to do with us, but because of other circumstances, it does.
Yeah, there were damages that extended beyond the person of Job. And certainly that would apply to his wife as well. I mean, she also lost 10 children. It wasn't just Job who lost 10 children and the respective families, but it was the wife as well. So point well taken. All right, anything else before we look at the text? All right, it is a short reading, so let's go ahead and take a look at verses 1 through 5 of chapter 1. We need a reader for that. Who would read for us verses 1 through 5 of Job chapter 1? Who's got that and can read us? Stan?
There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and turned away from evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, and 3,000 camels, and 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 sheep asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the children of the east. And his sons went and held a feast in the house of each one upon his day. And they sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and renounced God in their hearts." Thus did Job continually.
All right, thank you, Stan. So the character of Job, let's quickly summarize. How is Job characterized? What is the character of Job according to the Holy Spirit?
He was blameless and upright.
Blameless and upright. Blameless in the sense of being morally complete or perfected in that way. Someone who walks the straight and narrow path. It says that he feared God and turned away from evil. And so this was his character. Blameless, morally upright, feared God, turned away from evil. Now, when we think about all of the character of Job, and in terms of preeminent Bible personalities, we think of Job and should think of Job as being preeminent in his suffering. So the name Job is characterized with the preeminence of his suffering. Really along the same lines that Abraham is is characterized as being preeminent in faith, or that even Melchizedek is characterized as being the ideal priest and king. This is how we understand Job. This is his reputation. This is how God viewed Job in that sense. And so, very importantly, that we understand that he had this unblemished character, and that type of relationship that he had with God is fundamental, I think, to our understanding of his relationship with God and to his character itself. Bruce.
And of course, Shirley will show later, but here also that he was very well known. It wasn't an isolated person here just out in the wilderness.
Exactly. Regarded as the greatest of the East, he was extremely well known. And when his friends come to visit, they're coming from distant locations. They're not coming from the next county over. They're coming from very distant locations to presumably provide comfort. All right, now when we think about Job's family, some of us have large families. 10 is a lot of children. Now, but in that time, and to the people of the East, what would that represent? When a mother and father would have 10 children, what would that represent?
Wealth.
It would represent a great blessing upon that. It would be considered by the people of that generation and of that location as a great blessing from God to have a family of that size. Now, when we think about the wealth, all of the wealth that Job had accumulated, what would be the view of Job in relation to his wealth? Prominent and considered to be a great blessing from God to enjoy that type of accumulation of wealth. And so he was seen as having a great family, having a great wealth. What would we say about his family? Just from these short few sentences, what could we say about his family?
They were close-knit, evidently.
Exactly, closely knit, a tight-knit family. And each of the children on their day, many would consider that to be their birthday, but many on their day, all of the children assembled. It suggests to us, I think, very clearly that they were united, close-knit, as Bruce said, living in peace. Isn't that a blessing to have a family of 10 children living in peace, one with another? And of course, we have the devotion of Job to God and continually concerned about the spiritual well-being of his children. Now, very many servants, of course, would be a necessity in caring for all that he had responsibility for and all that he was given. So, when we think about Job and his devotion to God and his love for his children, this wraps it up. I mean, the summary of Job's character: impeccable character, blessed with a full and complete family, wealthy, respected as the greatest man of the East, and devout, offering burnt offerings continually. All right, so that's the setup. Now let's see the challenge of Satan in verses 6 through 12. We need another reader. Who would read verses 6 through 12 for us? You got it? Phil's got it?
Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord.
All right, thank you, Phil. All right, verse 6 implies there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, that there were times or occasions where the sons of God, these heavenly beings, angelic beings, presented themselves before Jehovah. That included Satan. He was also a heavenly being, but one who had rebelled against God and became an apostate son. But nevertheless, he is also among this assemblage. And then God asks him a question. Did God ask him a question because he didn't know? He was simply prompting a conversation with Job. And let's think about this. What did Satan's answer indicate? When we think about that first question that God posed to Satan, what does the answer indicate? What does he say?
Going back and forth on the earth.
Going back and forth on the earth. So what does that suggest about someone who's just going back and forth on the earth?
He's a hunter. He's praying for souls.
All right, very good. Scott?
He's causing trouble. He's telling God he's causing trouble. I was going to say he was telling God, I've been causing trouble on your earth.
Okay, all right. So he's really operating, isn't he, with a sense of independence. He's doing what he wants to do. And from 1 Peter chapter 5, what do we know about Satan? Just as God is implying. Looking for those whom he can devour. Prowling about, looking for those whom he can devour. And so this is how Satan presents himself, as this consistency with his nature, a detached spirit, if you will, responsible to no one. I'm not responsible to anyone. I go where I please. Phil?
It sort of gives the impression that I'm the top dog, you know, and what's similar to what you were saying is the earth is mine, everything down here is, I'm in control.
I'm not responsible to anyone. I can do as I please. Exactly. All right. Then what is Satan's response to God's second question? Have you considered my servant Job? By the way, it's very important that God refers to him as my servant. But what is Satan's response to that?
You take care of him.
All right. It's really a sneering reply, in a sense. He's in effect expressing contempt for the concept of moral goodness. In other words, men are not going to be morally good in service to you unless you give them something, unless there's a reward, unless they are paid for their service to you. That's the standpoint, if you will, that Satan is communicating. Bruce?
Sometimes like a young child that's spoiled or bribed by a parent to behave, that's why they behave, because you give them something. That's the only reason.
All right. So they're not really learning submission to authority or obedience, but they're being controlled by a reward system. All right. So this is the idea that Satan is putting forward, that his service is provided to you. It's rendered in exchange for the wealth that you bless him with. And Satan charged Jehovah, as the text indicates, with giving Job special protection. In essence, he was saying, why wouldn't he serve you, given how blessed you have made him as a person? Why wouldn't he serve you? Now, in verse 11, we have the important challenge, which is basically the challenge that Satan is putting forward is this. When he says, but put forth thy hand now and touch all that he has, he will surely curse thee to thy face. The question is there a service free from selfish interests and reward? In other words, cut off the rewards, cut off the payments, and let's see how Job responds to you under those conditions. That's really the question being put forward. So, how did Jehovah respond to that? How did God respond to that? Go ahead. Go ahead, but, all right, don't touch him. There's a limitation that's being put forward. Bruce.
And also, God is not going to be the one to bring about the disaster. It's Satan. So he says, you go and do this.
Right. The actions are executed by the apostate, rebellious being of Satan. Exactly. Now, this is actually quite an interesting challenge, isn't it? Can God know beforehand how a servant of his is going to respond to the testing of his faith? God has all knowledge, but man also has free will. And this is the challenge that is put forward. Can God know apart from testing whether a man will remain faithful when all around him in his life is caving in? Or did he create man who can act independently of God's foreknowledge of his actions? So this is a bigger question that's playing out in this scenario. But in any event, as Tim indicated, Jehovah surrendered Job's children and all his possessions to Satan, but Job told him to not touch the man himself. And so his power was limited. So now let's take a look at the calamities that Job faced, the beginning of his calamities. Verses 7 through 13. Who will read that text for us? Verses 7 through 13. Who has that? All right, Rick.
7 through 13. The Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, for there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. Put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord.
All right, my mistake. I meant 13 through 20. You want to keep reading, Rick?
Well, I can read 13 through 20. I was kind of wondering that when I started about
Make it 13 through 19. 13 through 19.
13 through 19. Now on that day, when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabians attacked and took them. They also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another also came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another also came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another also came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, the great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people and they died. And I alone have escaped to tell you."
All right, thank you, Rick. So, we know Satan was executing these actions, but given that as background, where did these actions originate? If we think about the text itself, where did the actions originate? They originated from Satan, but in actual play out, what's involved? Two of the evils came about from the hands of mankind, and two of the evils came about from the forces of nature. Now, exactly how Satan was given control over nature is not explained. The great wind, we understand what a tornado would look like and how that could crush a home and bring the walls in on people. The fire that came down, some think that that's lightning, but others would take a point of view that was more dramatic than that this was more like the fire and brimstone that came down on Sodom and Gomorrah. Not a lightning strike, but fire that consumed these possessions. But in any event, we would understand that the Sabaeans and Chaldeans were accomplishing the purpose of Satan in bringing about these evils. And also, how did Satan move? I mean, what was the speed with which Satan moved?
Well, quickly, but also he's crafty. So he was like, I'm gonna overwhelm him. I'm gonna make it all happen at the same time. Because one thing he might have been able to withstand, but let's just hit him. You know, it's a nuclear warhead, basically.
Yeah. And Carrie brings out exactly the point, is that there was no relenting on the part of Satan. It was just one thing after another, after another, after another. He moved extremely quickly and just overwhelmed Job with these calamities that came upon him. And this, I think, would be very dramatic. There's no time for reflection. And again, we see Satan's control, or ability at least, to use men and to use nature. But his power was and is limited by God's limitations placed on that power. All right, so Job overwhelmed. Now, we're going to take a look at his response. But Tim?
I just noted that there was a day. It reminds me of the Bible verse, sufficient for the day are the trials thereof. And so, you know, we do see, even though whenever he was given, or he had the right to go ahead and afflict, he gave it everything he had, you know, as far as taking everything away. But it does sort of show, though, categorically speaking, first of all, it was his possessions, you know, and his children. Next, it would be his health, right? And so maybe there's a day in which all these things happen. We're coping with that. We have to live through that. Another day, it will be our health. Another day, it will be something else. But every day, you know, that day, we need to get through that day. And I know a lot of people have been comforted by that, because we just take it day by day.
Yeah, good point. A very good point. Thank you for that. So, Job's response, verses 20 through 22. I'll read that for us. And it's really after learning about the death of his children. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Through all of this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. And so, of course, he's speaking. We just see the dignity of his response. There's the tearing of the robe, which we know is an expression of extreme grief, the shaving of the head, that could be for cleansing, it could be also just an expression of extreme grief, but he bowed down and worshiped. He did not sin, nor did he blame God. And what a lesson that is for us and for mankind, He did not blame God. There's a temptation when we cannot explain why bad things might be happening to us to blame God. But Job, with his impeccable character, despite what had happened, did not blame God. Now, there's a very interesting statement, of course, tied up in this, a very memorable statement. He certainly is accurate when he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. Man is born and man dies. We are born and we die. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. There's certainly a sense in which God is the creator and the originator of the nature that we enjoy and all of the moral and physical and spiritual laws. But in this case, it wasn't God who had taken away. It was Satan who had taken away. And operating, of course, with limits that had been placed upon him. All right. Yes, Bruce.
And also back in verse 16, the servant said, fire from God. So he's kind of putting the blame on God there, that's where it came from.
Yeah, it sets up that framework of understanding, doesn't it? Very good. Very good. All right. Chapter 2. All right, the second meeting between Job and God. We may not have time to do all of the reading, but what happens in the second meeting, chapter 2, between Job and God? God presents a question. Once again, it's what? Have you considered my servant Job? And what is Satan's response?
I haven't afflicted him personally or physically.
All right, exactly. So in the first round, Satan had failed to move Job to renounce God. That was Job's objective, Satan's objective, to get Job to renounce God. He had not been effective in that. But he wasn't going to give up, was he? And so we have this cryptic statement, skin for skin. And I think what that's really suggesting is that all that a man has, he will give up to preserve his life. Is, I think, the concept or the idea there. Carrie?
That's really interesting. I never thought about that before, but apparently Satan didn't learn anything because he tried all of this on Job, and then he tries it all again on God's son. And he failed the first time with only a man. And why did he think it would prevail against someone who also understood the mind of God?
Yeah, someone who himself was a heavenly being. Exactly. Good point. Very good observation. Thank you for that. But Satan is saying, you've allowed me to touch the outer skin, but you haven't allowed me to touch the inner skin. But if I do, if you allow such, that will provoke him to renounce you. And so again, Jehovah yields. Job's faith must be tested to the uttermost. But he added, yet again, a further restriction showing the limitation on Satan's power. His life must be preserved. You cannot touch his life. And so once again, we see the extent of his power limited. So the motives here of Jehovah and Satan are completely contradictory. What was Satan's goal? What was Satan's goal? We just said, what was it? To destroy his faith, to get him to renounce God. But God's goal was what? To perfect his faith through suffering. And so God was interested in a perfected faith. But Satan's purpose was to destroy him. All right, so the physical suffering. Job's further loss in chapter 2, verses 7 through 10, we have that detailed for us. These severe boils, I think the English Standard Version says loathsome sores, but these would be extremely painful, localized inflammations. Where did Job go, by the way? once he was afflicted with these boils? Where did he go? Where do we find him? In the ashes. Basically, we find that he has gone to the ash heap of the community. Now, what does that suggest? Yeah, like a leprosy in the sense that he was an outcast from society. So the greatest man of the East is now residing basically where the ashes are. And so he then receives an unexpected blow. And what is that unexpected blow that Job then receives as he's dealing with these horrible sores from head to toe? Anita?
His wife.
His wife. His wife. And his wife encourages him to do what? Curse God and die. And so her message would be basically, you are a man who has lived his life righteously before God. These are the outcomes of your life at this point in time. Your investment in serving God faithfully has not produced a desirable outcome. Why don't you just release your devotion, renounce your devotion to God, put an end to what has become an awful life, and die? That's basically the message that she is putting forward. Now, how does Job? Go ahead, Bruce.
No, go ahead.
But how does Job respond to that, Bruce?
When you read on through Job and you see the type of man he is, and as you said before, this all happened to his wife too. Sometimes we give her a bad rap here. She's now lost her husband, her source of finance. Everything is gone. And to me, it seems like, knowing Job, he says, that's not who we are.
Yeah.
That's not who you are. That's not what we do. And that's what the world's answer is, but that's not us.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think his response is, what you've just said is below the dignity of who you are and how you have lived your life. I think that's basically what his response is to his wife.
I don't think he's degrading her, but
he's
trying
disappointed.
to support her.
He's disappointed,
Yeah.
but he's saying, as perhaps all of us have said to us at one time, you behaved in a way that doesn't display the dignity that we normally associate with you, or the character which you know you should display. And I think it's more of that kind of response to her. And so we could go into greater detail about that, but we won't take time to do that right now. But in all of this, Job did not sin. It says what in verse 10? In all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. All right, Anne.
Wouldn't it have been wonderful if even had the same kind of husband?
Yeah, exactly. If Adam had responded to Eve the way Job responded to his wife. Yes, indeed. That's a wonderful observation. All right, we're just about out of time. I think that clock is a little fast, actually. We're just about out of time, but the three friends show up. They come from distant locations. We assume that this didn't take place immediately, that this had to be arranged. They meet and come in from different locations. They apparently weren't Hebrew in origin. They see Job at a distance. They hardly recognize him. There's an expression of extreme grief. But then they sit down in silence. Why silence? Why silence? Anita?
Sometimes there's just nothing to say that will be a comfort.
All right.
You're kind of overwhelmed yourself. You don't know what to say, so you just sit with it.
All right. You're there. You're present. You've expressed grief, but you say nothing. You do not know what to say. Bruce?
Verse 13, it ends, it says, they saw his pain.
They saw his pain. It was obvious what he was experiencing. Now, briefly, let me suggest something in addition to that. being able to read ahead, and knowing what comes later, their silence also, I mean, their theology was your suffering is a result of your sin. Your suffering is ginormous. Therefore, your sin must be ginormous as well. And it didn't fit with their theology to be great comforters at that time. In fact, they might have believed that providing Job comfort at this time would actually violate what God has meted out against Job. And I think this is what we're going to see, because as we continue with the reading and understanding their point of view. But in any event, they did not provide that comfort. And they might have thought, how could we comfort Job? He's being punished so greatly by God. Tim?
That's a profound thing that you're talking about there, that very idea, because, you know, if we apply this to ourselves, so often we might prejudge, or we're judging others. You're there because you put yourself there. You made your bed, you're going to have to sleep in it, et cetera, et cetera. But we haven't walked in those steps, and we don't know the circumstances that this has come about. And the person could be inadvertently, you know, like Job, you know, done nothing at all. And I believe Christians, we can become guilty of that in our own self-righteousness, you know. And we look down on others, and here they are sitting there, high-minded, and you're getting what you deserve, and all of that. And not saying a word to encourage or help, which if we see people in deep need, we should be responding positively to help. Rather, they say nothing. You're right. And saying nothing speaks a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. All right, we've exhausted our time, but just let us think about this. All of the things that Job lost: his possessions, his children, his health, his community standing, the comfort from his wife, the silence of his friends, I think implying their condemnation. Yet to be revealed is his greatest suffering, because he's going to be searching for God's explanation of why he has become, in Job's eyes, his enemy. All right, we'll pick up with that next week. Thank you for your attention and participation. Much appreciated.